All right, and we're back. Rosemary, can you hear me? Okay, are you live, Rosemary?
Switch to my mobile network. I apologize for that.
Okay, I can hear you loud and clear. Welcome.
Perfect. Welcome.
All right, are you ready for your talk?
Sure. How do I move the slides here? You're going to bring them up. Okay, perfect. Excellent. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for your interest in looking at a little bit of research that we've done. First, I'll explain a little bit about who I am. So as everybody else here probably that creates games, I'm interested in all things that have some kind of an art form and storytelling. And of course, that then really works out as very, very long hours. I have a background in technology and in storytelling. So I've worked for a lot of large companies, none of them gaming, except when I then switched from the last company that I was at, Microsoft. I joined a startup, and they were using gaming to change urban environments. So it was like playing SimCity in real life, if you will. And that got me really excited about the power of gaming. And so when a friend of mine, who's the founder of the Digging Deep project, asked me if I could help her digitize the self-help book that she'd written for young teens, I jumped on the chance. And a lot of the research that I'm going to be talking about is for that game. So I'm going to be using examples, and I'm going to show a little bit more about what gaming can do in a serious context and how you portray that. So I hope you can see those slides. So we're going to talk a little bit about the origin story, where we're from. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we design for impact, and I'm going to use our research as an example, how that feeds back, and then just some lessons learned from this year and from what we've been doing. So the Digging Deep project, just to set the stage, is a nonprofit organization, and it's mainly been used for the book called Digging Deep. It was a book that helped young people that had chronic or serious illnesses really figure out, what was going on with them, going on in their life, and also really build emotional resilience. Because a lot of time when you're sick, the whole focus is on really getting through that illness and getting through what you're going through, but not really on emotions, on how to deal with it and how to deal with how life changes. And so the founder created that book, and then we've turned that also jointly into a game called Shadow's Edge. And we also have a community for professionals and parents, and a community for young people. And the reason I bring this origin up a little bit is because we have a purpose with the game, and therefore that's why we did the research. So everything that we do is really designed to create impact. Picking a game was not random. So we started with a bunch of research on the market and looked at who do we want to target, and we knew we wanted to really help out teens, specifically the ones that have chronic and serious illnesses, because that was our audience with the book anyways. But we also wanted to make sure that we, hit a little bit of a wider target, because especially this year, everybody is dealing with something. And so we really also included anxiety, depression. So we looked online and we did a big data study on that. And I'll explain a little bit what we did. And that then informed the design of our game. So what does that look like? Well, this is a little bit of a description of our game loop, as I would say. This is basically how we run around really getting the impact. Because if you want to figure out how things work, you have to start somewhere. You start with really figuring out, okay, where is my audience? So you look at how many people do we want to interview, and to do that, you have to really make sure that you survey. We really started with a big audience. We did data mining. We then narrowed it down, as you can see, through certain criterias, and then you sit them down, kind of like with speed dating. You do very short interviews to see if they qualify for one of the types of studies and one of the types of research that you want to do. Once you've done that, you get into the actual research. Now, of course, in parallel to this whole process, you have to actually prepare all of that research. So you have to know, what are the criteria? What do you want to measure? How do I measure this? Who helps me with that? And in the case of using information for chronically or seriously ill young people, you have to make sure that it's all validated, that you have professionals on your team. And also you have to make sure, of course, that what you're doing also works for the young people, because forcing them to take some kind of a survey, but they're not really interested in what you're doing or in the subject, doesn't really help either. So to get those people into an interview room, as you can see on the top right, that's number one, to really get the right audience with the right criteria and who are really interested, who have a problem and are really interested in solving it. So it's a little bit less about the game at this point still. It's more about, what are we trying to solve? And in parallel, you're trying to figure out the process as to how I can measure if I have solved the problem, that, how does that work for me? And how do I do that? How do I measure that? How do I prove that? How do I create that evidence that says, yes, what you are doing is working? And then there's a third process that runs in parallel, and today I'm going to talk a little bit less about the game development, but really more about how we set up the studies and where it comes through. But in parallel to this, of course, you already start preparing, because to create these surveys, you have to actually have something for them to test, and you have to have something for them to look at. Sometimes that's mock-up, sometimes it's a prototype, sometimes it's a full game, specifically if you want to go into longer studies like clinical studies or really user experience for the longer term, then obviously you need to have the product available. And with that also comes a lot of responsibility to then make sure that that product doesn't change during these studies. So you're going to have multiple versions of your product. So one thing, as you see here, is getting to the patients or getting to your players. And the other thing is then really making sure that everything that you do gets you ready to be able to talk to them. When you then conduct those interviews, then comes the next hustle, because then you have to bring the results back. And you have to figure out, what do I do with those results? How do I interpret what patients and what players have said from the game? How do I then turn that into some design elements? So as an example, people told us that they would love to communicate with other players, or at least have that feeling of connection. However, we also knew we're a very small company, and if you do want to really communicate, we didn't want to build a Facebook or an Instagram or any of that. And in addition, in a lot of these communities, you have, very strict monitoring rules. Even more so if you're dealing with people who have potentially been diagnosed with depression or other mental health condition. And so there's limitations to what you can do, and you have to become creative. Then you start implementing that into the game, and you would think, yay, we're done. We can really deliver something. But no, if you really want to validate everything, the actual process starts from scratch. And you do that really during a long cycle, depending on the studies. So let me talk a little bit about the studies that we have done. As I said, we started with some big data market research. This we didn't actually do ourselves. We commissioned this. So we had an agency that really specializes in this kind of thing, and we gave them the criteria. What do we want to know? So we wanted to find a couple of groups of people. We wanted to find 17 to 24-year-olds who may or may not have a chronic or a serious illness. So either they have been impacted by that, they have had one, they're now through it, they're still within it. So in various stages, we really wanted like a big crowd in that area. We did the same thing then for younger people, for 13 to 18-year-olds. And then because we didn't have a lot of data there, we did the same thing for 24 to 30-year-olds. Those first studies that we did and that data that we gathered were over 14 million conversations harvested from anything from social media to topical sites to things like, cancer associations or diabetes associations to messaging boards, for example, or, in school kinds of messaging boards and applications. And then we had to obviously work on all of those results. So keep in mind, this is in parallel while we are already starting to develop the game so that we can really make sure that we have something to be able to test. the main things that this research informed us with is, what are people talking about? What are the problems that come up? So what are the sentiments? And those things really informed us that a lot of the teens that are facing something, that are depressed or anxious or are really stressed out, they really don't have anybody to talk to. Technically they would, but they don't feel as comfortable in their normal setting and in the real world to do that. And a lot of them don't really have access to therapy, or they're on wait lists, or they do have therapy, but it's just not often enough. And in those cases, they felt lonely, they felt frustrated, they felt like they couldn't communicate, so they're stuck in their own world. And we really wanted to bring that back into the game. And that's how the game Shadow's Edge was then created. With everything that we had learned from the big data market research going into the way that the world looks, the isolation, as you may have seen from a previous speech that I did at Pocket Gamer, the world when you enter Shadow's Edge is really completely empty. It actually looks a lot like, well, the rest of the real world in March, April, if you will. All the streets are empty, there's nobody around. And your quest when you come in is to save that world by starting up these ways of working on yourself. They also told us that it is hard to work on themselves and they just don't know where to start. And so we have in the game, we've implemented prompts and questions, things that they can ponder, that they have to find, that they have to make an effort to do something for. So they have to find the pages of a missing journal and then really figure out how to work through those questions and dig deeper into themselves to find those answers. All of that is based also on some principles of therapy. So we took narrative therapy for any elements where we asked them to really work on themselves. We took artistic expression for any of the creative work. So what you see here in the background, for example, is one of the street artists that we worked with. I took one of those prompts about the mask and it really started designing something around it. And then we went back to the big data market research, and with what we've built in, we started asking different questions. If there was something available, would teens actually want to use it? What age groups would it be good for? And we started finding out while we were building the game that the audience were actually older than we expected. We had wanted to target teens, so 13 to 21, and we found that our sweet spot was really turning out to be 17 to 24. So big data research may not be easy. A lot of it, there's specific tools involved. These tools can also be very, very expensive, but it's really worth if you want to really find the right audience for you. Because what we then did from that is really, we had a profile of who our players were. We created player journeys and figured out, okay, these are the kind of people that we now really want to do something with in our further study. So with our beta program, we then set up what we called a psychological impact study. Now, we did that study ourselves because we wanted to be fast about it. And a lot of the research, actually a lot of time goes into it. And so we worked with a department of the Dutch government for mental health. They specifically are looking for digital tools. And we worked with University of Twente in the Netherlands, who helped us come up with the research, if you will, and also the questions and the surveys and how the methodology of actually measuring if what we were doing was working. So we set up the study, and it was 6 weeks with 55 players. All of these players had some kind of diagnosed condition, be it from trauma to cancer, Lyme disease. We have people that had severe depression, for example. And we really looked at the narrower criteria that we got from the big data market study. So the age group was 17 to 24, with the median being around 21. We then set up that they had to play a certain amount of time, and we looked at how do you measure that somebody becomes mentally stronger. We call that resilience. And we looked at 7 different types of factors that can influence resilience that we thought with our game we could actually do something about. One of them, for example, is proactive coping, getting them to do something so that they feel they have a more active role in their health. Another one was optimism, trying to really see something good in what is happening to you and derive meaning from that is another one. So with the study criteria that we had from the big data market search, we then really figured out with these 2 institutions, how do we set it up and how do we conduct it and how do we measure it? The players got a baseline survey at the beginning and then a survey at the end, the same survey basically, to see how they improved. We gave them certain scales of feelings and emotions. We also did impact interviews, and we had player diaries, and we had a psychologist on call in case something happened or in case there was some feelings or things that the players weren't able to deal with. And what you see here in the background is just some of the outcomes from the psychological study where they told us what they were feeling. So we found that specifically in 3 areas, the game was really creating an impact. That's optimism, positive self-identity, and emotional regulation. That means being able to handle your emotions and recognize them a little bit more early before they become too strong, and being able to do something about that. And so we knew that those 3 factors were actually really good, and that's something that really sticks also to build resilience. And so one of the things that we then looked at is, okay, what can we then build into the game? Because in parallel, of course, we did ask these players, so what would you see in the game that would help you more? How can we change certain things? One of the feedbacks, for example, was that they would love there to be more communication. So they liked that there was journaling. They could paint and they could really vent through graffiti. They liked the grittiness and being able to vent. But then it had nowhere to go. And so one of the things that they really wanted us to do is create a community within the game, which we then did. So in this in-game community, you can now take a picture of your world and you can share it with other people. Within confinement of, having to be compliant for HIPAA and COPPA and all those kinds of things, we really wanted to make sure that you can share, but you can't really interact with other people to be able to and allow us as a small company not to have to really monitor too much. Obviously, we do monitor the content during images and with limited comments in there. And so those were some of the outputs that we put in there. The other thing that we knew is, okay, well, this is a study we did. How do we now really make sure that it's officially and clinically validated? How do you set up a further study? And so we gave out a grant, and we had Lurie's Children's Hospital, we had Lurie's Children's Hospital do a clinical trial. Now, the clinical trial wasn't really for impact in the game. And that's why, I haven't put it up here as such. But what we did do while we were conducting the clinical trial, we also wanted to continue in developing it. And so when we had the chance this year, when COVID started, and we started seeing an uptick in numbers of the players that had no condition, but were simply stressed out, felt frustrated or isolated, we knew we really wanted to do something to make the game good for them as well in the current situation that everybody in the world was going through. And so we really hustled, and we started taking a lot of the psychological impact study work back into the game. We also started a new player experience research. So another impact study, but this time with players that we knew from the 30,000 players that we had. We picked 200 that we knew really had worked through the game as far as possible, and a lot of them even finished. And we looked at what do they get out of the game and how can we make sure that we do more of that. And because they were expert players and because they are young people and they were not shy in telling us what to do and what not to do, we finally had a selection of 24 people that helped us really figure out, what do we do next with this? How can we make practical steps to address some of the things that we saw pop up in our community. So the 4 images that you see here are from our community we call Shadowgram. And what we saw with COVID is that there is a lot of talk about things that happen in their life now that COVID is there. We saw a lot more current events popping up. We really saw people moving to here to also vent and really think about things in a different way. And that's what we wanted to conduct. The study we did over this period was 3.5 months roughly with 26 players, where we had them play regularly And then we did interviews. We really did in-depth interviews in 2 tracks. One was the experience that they had in how the game helped with what they were doing and with how they were feeling and how they were doing. And the second track was to look at what are the things we can implement. And then we shortened our development cycle, and we had 1 to 2 week sprints where each time we would implement something in the game, upload it to the application store, so that we also made it available to everybody, not just to our research group. But we did that based on the feedback that we got from the players to get the player experience in, and really make sure that the ones that got something out of it, that they gave us that experience to put back into the game. So that then worked out as a lot of new, smaller features that we could easily implement, but that still would give that feeling of having created input. One of the things that we found throughout this process is that players are actually really wanting to help. They want to help you make your game better, and they want to help other people through this game, and that's part of what they love about our game. And so we really wanted to do them justice. So here's just a couple of examples. On the left-hand side, they wanted more missions and things to explore to keep them coming back. So that's one of the things we implemented. They also wanted to have a path to mastery. Our tool is not a traditional entertainment game, right? We want it to be therapeutic. We want it to really help them work through some tough stuff. And so we had focused for the first release really on the changes that people go through when they go through a journey of hardship, and helping them with that, building in the right metaphors, building in the right steps, showing them, having them be able to connect with the characters so that they see parts of themselves in those characters and that they feel they're not alone in this. But what they were lacking is, okay, that's great, but how do I then become better at that? So for a lot of people, and we saw that also in the retention numbers in the early days, we had a retention of probably about one or 2 days. Then it went up to 7 days, but then we kind of got stuck. And with this whole COVID period, with all of the scrums that we did, we actually got that up to now a 42-day, which is on average. So we're getting there, because the longer you work on yourself, the more you can actually really take out of that. So that was very important to us. So we built in this path to mastery. They wanted to become better at journaling, at figuring that out. And it can be very daunting to have a blank page and have some difficult questions about yourself, even if we think that those questions might be simple. We saw, for example, that the players were stuck at the question that asked, what do you like about yourself? What are some things that are good about yourself? And everybody got stuck there. And so we've implemented a way to become better at doing those things. For one, they wanted to see their progress, so that's what we implemented with the player titles, and then the connection. And so we combined the connection factor and having that update factor and bringing in new things with a messaging system within the game where they talk to the characters, and we gave each of the characters a role in helping our players become better at helping themselves. So Tyler, for example, it gives tips and tricks about journaling, how to start writing. It can be as simple as making a task list, and then from that task list, pick 1 or 2 words that jump out of you of what you really like doing. And from that, you can talk about, okay, here are the things I like. Why do I like them? Is it because I'm good at them? And then from there, they get back to that question, what do you like about yourself and what do you think you're good at? And so these kinds of back and forth in the messaging system was something that really came directly from our players. And through the summer, with a lot of the mock-ups, they helped us actually build that into the game in a way that they liked. Still in a gamified way, so you can see you get experience points for it. But the point is not that. The point is that we really, everything we did in the last couple of months was based on things that players told us, not ideas that we had. Now, I mentioned the clinical trial before. So we had the year-long study with Loris Children's Hospital. This is an independent study. We have no influence. We also don't have influence over the timing. So they had 192 patients that were going into cancer treatments. And what they found with those types of patients is that they often really lose hope, which you would think now that the disease is over, it becomes better. But when you're facing a chronic illness, I have one myself, so I can attest to that. While you're in it, it's not about how you feel about it. It's not about dealing with it. It's really about, okay, how do I get through this? How do I survive this? And so a lot of the patients, when things then start to ease up and you start feeling better, that's exactly where it then hits you. Oh my God, I've lost a year of my life because of cancer treatments. Oh my God, I've lost friends. I'm behind on school. What do I do for a future? Do I even have a future? Because it can come back, for example. And all those types of questions really give them a very big variability in emotions. And so that's one of the things that we really wanted to try with the clinical trial to prove out if that works. So we don't have any results published yet. We're dependent on the schedule of Loris Children's Hospital. However, preliminary results from there show that similarly to the impact study that we did, we have a positive effect on self-identity. We also have an effect on people actually actively exploring their identity. And we, compared to the control group, there is a much more proactive coping going on. So people that are actively really seeking out ideas and things that they can do. We also had an effect on emotional regulation. So really being able to handle things earlier and bring them up and actually starting to communicate. And from a lot of the anecdotal references that we saw, we know that a lot of our teens started to use the game to actually talk to other people and talk to their parents, talk to their friends, and really reach out to people. And that's something that for us is really special when we hear those stories that friends, that said, I never knew that my kid felt this way, for example. So this is sort of the 4 prongs that we build research upon. So it's the big data, market research, impact studies that we do ourselves, but that we really work with partners, with clinical psychologists. And then the player experience to really make sure that we keep it current and up to date. And then we will do further clinical trials as well, depending on the subjects we want to go into. For example, really look at the depression scales and see what we can do in that specific area, non-cancer related. We have roughly 30,000 downloads, and the player time went up this year from average 6 minutes to 12 minutes. So that's pretty good for us, with people really coming back up to 42 days. So that's better. It's in nowhere where we want to be, but we also didn't want to really just reach out and just build something, right? We're building this very slow and steady and really getting into what this is good for and why this worked. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about, some of the anecdotes that we've had, just the feedback from other players, from people who helped us, from psychologists, and also from partners who we've now started to work with. So here's just a couple of musings and thoughts. What we observe is that there's in the player groups, there's a large group of people who really want to help. They love the games. They come in there for different reasons. So some of them come because they like journaling. Some come because they like art. Some find us through their therapists, through their family. And some people really are just looking around for something to help them because they're feeling stressed. So they're looking for words like stress, anxiety, etc. A lot of this matches up with the big data research that we did at the beginning, but also because not everything was matching up, and because we now have a much wider audience and not just chronic or serious illness patients. We did another big data study just this year that looked at general teen well-being, and we went out on the street and actually interviewed people for a short documentary that we're working on for teen mental health. And what was really surprising to us was we have these official numbers through research again, right, of what does it mean. So for example, the American Psychology Association says that roughly 27% of young people between the age of 10 and 24 have at least one serious depression episode in that time, potentially more. And that increases if you look at like a smaller population with chronic and serious illnesses. 1 in 4 in that age group have a chronic or a serious illness, and that in 90% of the cases then comes with an associated depression, anxiety attack, panic attacks, those kinds of things. So you think 27%, that's already very high. That's the research that the APA did. Now, with the World Health Organization, if you really actually look at clinical studies and who is clinically depressed and who's clinically really feeling bad or has a mental health condition, then those are lower, because in the general market research, obviously, there's really just people that have experienced it themselves, but not all of them may have gone through a doctor. But when we went out on the street and we did our big data study and really just simply asked young people in those age groups, we asked them the question, what do you think, how many people now in 2020 are having mental health issues? So it could be severe depression, it could be really anxious or very stressed out, but really who's not feeling well at all mentally. And all of them said at least 40%, some of them even up to 70%. So on average, they said 40 to 50% of the people around me that I see are facing something and have episodes and are depressed or even going to the doctors for it. And so if you see those numbers, then you can see that with the research, you can't just rely on data you see on the internet. You have to go out on the street and then see what it does. And for us, really surprising was when we then talked to them and we said, look, we're doing this. We have our game, right? And we're doing this documentary really to raise awareness that this is a problem and to raise the awareness that we have to bring other tools. But let's just do the math, right? If we're talking World Health Organization, then it's 10 to 24 is the age group that they call young people. So it's adolescents and young adults. That's, again, just statistic numbers, that's 1.2 billion people on this planet out of the total almost 8 that we have. So 30% of that, let's take 30 is because the math is easier than 27, that would be 400 million young people. There's simply not enough psychologists and therapists and counselors to be able to handle those. If those unofficial numbers are even higher, or if people are facing things that they've not been diagnosed with yet, but it is still a huge problem, then those numbers become higher. So we need tools, we need different approaches, different ways. We're one of them. We see a lot of things pop up. We even see mental health games pop up now. There's a couple out there that have different audiences, different approaches, different statistics. There's applications based on well-being, on mindfulness. Obviously, probably every one of you knows Calm, for example, who's been around for quite a while, that tries to help in that field. But what we found is that on the streets, when we asked them, what was surprising to us is because they know this and because we told them what it's for and why we're doing this, everybody was okay to be recorded. Everybody stood on video, even young kids. And even more surprising, we had 13, 14, 15-year-olds that we asked in the streets. And then we went to their parents and said, look, here's what your child said. Would you be okay with us using that in our documentary? And would you be okay with your child helping us on the game? And every single one said, yeah, that's fine. We see this as an issue. It's around. And so we're happy to help with that. And so kind of leading on from that, I think that if you want to develop a serious game that has a purpose specifically also that is very intimate, like mental health, it's a very intimate thing, right? There's stigma attached to it. What do you say? People say, how are you doing? And then you say, well, actually, I'm really doing crap. But nobody wants to hear that, right? They just want to hear, yeah, I'm fine. And so all of that, I think, there's a couple of things that happened this year that helped raise that awareness. But to be able to then do something with that information and get that information, even, you really have to make sure you create an environment for trust. So we also did research on what are like the processes for the FDA, what are the processes for trials, how do we store that data, and where do we put the data? What do we do with that? What are we allowed to do with that? Who's allowed to handle it? What's the process for handling it? What happens if we then, because we are working with young people, then also have to show that data, for example, to the parents? How do we handle that? How do we make sure that is secure, that it can't end up anywhere? And so, as you can see from all of this, just building a game is a smaller part. What becomes bigger and bigger and bigger as you start creating impact is really making sure that the people that you do this for are happy with this, that it's working for them, and that even if the numbers seem small for the downloads, what we know is we are actually really making a difference in those people's lives. And that's more important, to really get that stabilized and then grow, rather than just, put your game out on the market as soon as you can and then really start marketing it. So creating that environment for trust can be a very costly thing, because you have to make sure the processes are in place. It's not a short-term thing to do. You have to get all kinds of approvals and legal issues and consent forms and all those kinds of things. You have to build mechanisms into the game to be able to do that. And all of that is based on the various parts of research. As you saw, the 4 parts of research that we do, plus then also what you have to know about legal and technical issues. Another thing we really learned from this is that we have to be very much stricter of designing in a learning loop. We started out with a nice small learning loop for a beta, but then we went to bigger steps because we wanted to really implement more features, bigger features, and we also wanted to work more with partners. And what we now are finding is that for the players themselves and for the people who we are doing this for, we really have to make sure that we keep it short, that we keep it current, that we keep on feedback from them, really put that into the game. So instead of doing certain releases and then having a bit of research attached to that, we are now in a constant search loop of, testers getting something done, each of the sprints that actually has actual testers that fit our profile of what we're really looking for and what they're trying to solve. And then any update, even if it's a 2-week sprint, it gets moved. It doesn't get designed unless these teens or these young adults have actually signed off on it and said, yeah, that is an improvement. We are doing this. And so that's a constant loop of finding the testers, which brings you back to the data research, to the market research. Where do we find those testers? Where do we find new people? We can't just use the same, let's just say 26 that we used in the summer, for example. We have to keep mixing it up to get fresh eyes on it. And so it becomes an actual long playing loop, if you will, to design. In addition to this, we've had quite a bit of luck this year with getting some grants and some partnerships. So we managed to get a grant from a Swiss organization to help raise awareness for the topic, which has informed a lot of our research, like, for example, the documentary, the questioning that we did. We also just recently have gotten a grant to work on a release that will be applied to a very specific audience for young people who have dealt with abuse, with violence and all those kinds of things. And so therefore, we're setting up a new, larger research loop. And the reason I'm explaining this is because apart from these mini loops that we are doing, we also constantly have the bigger picture in our head, where we want to help as many people as we can, and not one size fits all, but also we have to make sure that we get the bandwidth as a small organization to really be able to do those and to handle those. And so we're teaming up with partners. We're teaming up with partners from the healthcare sector to make sure that they can help us really find those audiences that are very specific. For example, we're working with youth centers for adverse affected youth and other organizations like that. That also means that, we need to make sure that whatever we do in the development actually sticks. And so we're working with our developers, but we're also bringing in an advisory board to help us. The good news is that because we are a nonprofit, everybody's quite open to help us, but it does still mean that there's a lot of coordination. So if you remember from the first bits, there's this parallel world to, you have to get your research done, and then there's a lot of other stuff that has to catch up. We've also seen from these last 5-6 months that more playtime means more impact. So everything we do is driven by really getting our retention up and getting our playtime up, getting them to engage longer with what they're going through. Now, this is not game specific. So we talk to a lot of psychologists and therapy is something difficult, right? It has stigma, just that has stigma attached to it. But even if it's counseling in school or something like that, people don't really, especially young people, they often don't want to stick with it, even though they do feel bad. It feels like homework, right? It feels like something that is not normal, that doesn't come into their into their actual world. So while we are all over the world doing a lot for our physical fitness, we're still not really doing enough for our mental fitness. I think in this part, COVID has been quite good because the awareness is bigger. It's more people talk about it more openly, and also specifically young people actually are starting to reach out and ask for help. So that I think is good. But we really want to make sure that with the tool, we then play into that and we give them that playtime, because the longer they spend with the questions, the longer they spend with their therapy, the better it works in making them more resilient and stronger. And that's why we also started now really partnering with psychologists specifically and really looking at, in the context of therapy, how do you use the game, what works, what doesn't work, and how can we improve the game to make sure that it also fits not just for self-play, for self-help, but also in the context of, for example, a therapeutic setting. And all of that, the most important thing is that to focus on the problem you're trying to solve. We're trying to make people emotionally stronger, more resilient, more able to handle the tough stuff that life throws their way. And what better way to really bring across certain points than storytelling? Because stories have the power to not just bring a point across, but actually really inspire. And so we also keep on working on, not just the story of the game. Obviously, there's a city, it's been hit by a storm. There's metaphors in there about the characters, about the world, about the backgrounds, everything. But we also focus on more on how do we tell the story of what we want to do and what we want to achieve, to be able to get these partners to help us with all of the things we can't do because we're just a very tiny organization. And so we really focus a lot more on the stories of our players, the stories of what they've been going through and where they are going. And that has helped us a lot this year. So with that, if you remember, this is taken in March, when everything just started. And that's actually sort of a corresponding picture of what Shadow's Edge looks like when you come in, where the streets are empty as well. Okay, in Vegas, there's no flying taxis because there has been no storm, obviously. But there were eerie similarities. And one of the things that we've seen most with the storytelling part, what the teens and the young adults connected with was, wow, this really looks like the world today. And, if we want to help those people make their world more colorful and easier to live in and more fun, and give them that road towards a blue sky and help them become resilient enough to go on that journey and to do that journey, then we need to make sure as developers that we take that impact seriously and do everything we can to build into the game exactly what they need to be able to get there. So with that, I think I'm a couple of minutes early, but I thank you very much for listening to me today. And I hope I was able to inspire you just a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a very inspirational talk. We do have some questions coming in, and let me see. So Liam is asking, you mentioned having 1 to 2 week sprints. Did the length change back and forth during the project, or did you eventually settle for one length?
We settled on 1 to 2 weeks. So before we had bigger buckets, and we said, okay, if we're going to build in a messaging system, we're going to do everything perfectly. We're going to have all the exercises in there. The text is going to be done. It's going to be translated in everything, etc. What we do now is we really do these rapid sprints. Sometimes if there's like small things we can do, we just upload them. So it'll be a week sprint because we can, and it's easy. But generally, on average, now we have 2 week sprints, and then we do the testing for a week, and then we upload. So the overall release time, if you will, then is 3 weeks. That is to really see the change, if you will. And before it was like 3-4 months mainly.
And the next question we have here is from Julia, and she's asking, what are the tools that you use to identify your target audience?
Yeah, everything we can find. So there's a tool called Forrester, but the licenses are humongously expensive, and so we were lucky enough to get a partner that's called CM Plus, and they do that type of marketing research for large companies, and they were able to get us a lot of that data. We went through a lot of the research with some of the universities. So we had a few people that did master studies and those kinds of things that did some of the research for us. And then we sneakily asked one of our friends at Microsoft to do some of the big data studies that they did, that they run in the background when people search on the internet. So they use Microsoft's tools. For ourselves to do like basic research, we use brute force analysis, Google, and then we really like to talk to people. So what we do is we go to all of these kinds of organizations that we think has the right audience, and we reach out via LinkedIn, and that's been really successful for us. I mean, we've gone and found youth organizations, adverse affected youth, even military people. We've had youth centers locally. We even had worked with the health department in Australia now, who have 80,000 youth connected to their network. We reach out to hospitals, and all of that is done via LinkedIn, really with targeted audiences, where we send out roughly about 400 mails a week to get to the right audience, and then ask them, do you have teens for us, or do you have young people that could need this?
Amazing. It's so nice to hear that there's so many out there that would like to help you. That's super cool. So one last question, and that is, so out of all of the things that you learned on this journey, what is like the biggest surprise for you that you found out while doing this and all of the studies? Was there anything in there that really stood out?
Yeah, I think for me personally, it's the surprise is really, the players is what gets me going every day, right? Because this is a lot of work for a small company. But if I hear these stories where people have been able to really get something from this game, we had one player where we had an interview, and then we asked her, so do you share the game with friends? And she's like, I have no friends. I'm like, oh gosh. And then 4 months later, we asked the same question again, and I was really feeling badly. And she's like, yeah, no, I've shown it to like 4 people. And so just those kinds of stories, them being so willing to share things that makes them so vulnerable, that they are alone, that they don't have friends, or talk about suicide, for example. Those kinds of things was really inspires me and surprising.
Okay, then thank you so much. And I guess you will be in the speakers lounge after this, answering any other questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, and we'll be right back after a short break.